All right, we are recording. So it is Tuesday of week 6. This week is all about ideologies. We're starting the second block of our class. Basically, this class is divided up into 3 different 5-week blocks, and we're starting week 6, which means we're in on a new chunk of the class, and this will take us up to the world wars. We're going to be talking about 19th century ideologies here in a little bit. I haven't graded all of your exams yet. It's been a crazy weekend. All the weekends are crazy, but I hope to get to that soon enough. What I'm going to do is I'm going to screen share my PowerPoint here and basically just go through this. I'm going to record it. I'm going to post it up on the week 6 folder as well. But I think this is going to be a good introduction to what we'll be talking about for the next several weeks. We're going to focus in on socialism and Marxism today. They're not the only ideologies we're talking about, but I like to highlight them because they're the most fun, I think, to talk about. But what we're essentially doing is, from now on in this class, I'm going to keep rubbing my head too, by the way, because I cut my own hair. I tried cutting my own hair this weekend, and I cut it really short, and I can't believe it's hard. It's like hard to get used to that. Like, I have no hair. So I'm going to just keep being obsessive compulsive, I suppose, during the video. Sorry. So what we're doing for the rest of this class is we're looking at the modern era. Like, basically, after the French Revolution and Napoleon gets overthrown and the Industrial Revolution gets kicked off, we're looking at the modern era. This is what historians call the modern era. Basically, the last 200 years. The last 200 years since approximately the year 1815 is what starts the modern era. And that's just like an arbitrary year historians have picked because reasons, you know. I mean, why not 1816? Why not 1814? Who knows? Maybe it's just a nice full number. It looks nice. So there's 3 different ingredients to ushering in the modern era, and this is kind of important to know. When we look at modernity, when we look at modern problems, it's a result of 3 different ingredients. The first one is the Enlightenment. This is the oldest ingredient. It had been around since the 1700s, but it's just, you know, people milling about, talking to each other about like the big questions of life. You know, like how do humans coexist with one another? How do we best prosper? These are the questions that, you know, Adam Smith was putting forward in Wealth of Nations. Liberty, what makes a good government? This is John Locke. This is Rousseau. You know, this is like, these are the guys, some of the guys that you read in the first couple weeks of the semester. You know, the Enlightenment raises all these questions about like what constitutes the best communities, how best do humans get along, good government, how much freedom should we allow, laws, blah, blah, blah. Okay. The second ingredient is the French Revolution actually happening. So what the French Revolution did was, and we talked about this at the time, those Enlightenment ideas were just theories. No one was actually trying out, you know, constitutional government. No one was talking about the rule of law versus having a king. Like, no one was actually doing those things. And then the French Revolution put some of those ideas into practice with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, with abolishing the Estates General, with getting rid of the King of France. Getting rid of being a euphemism for, you know, executing him. But this didn't happen very peacefully, because the king dies, a bunch of people die during the Reign of Terror. Napoleon ushers in this, like, you know, 15-year-long period of warfare. So it's not a very peaceful actualization of these Enlightenment ideas, but nonetheless it happens, and it's kind of practice for what's to come. And then we get the third ingredient of the modern era, which is the Industrial Revolution. You know, undergirding all these political and intellectual changes are very real, tangible changes to the economy of the West. And this means, you know, the Industrial Revolution is something that's a very unequal thing. A lot of people make a lot of money off of this, especially people who own factories or stump up the cash for, you know, some kind of investment enterprise. And then there's a lot of wage slaves, you know, who work 16, 18-hour days, 6 days a week, are, you know, barely clinging on to a livelihood, losing their hands in machines, and, you know, their children's growth are stunted because of all the pollution and lack of nutrition. So it's a very unequal thing, but nonetheless, it ushers in the modern era. So all of these things together, these three things, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, these are critical baking ingredients to, you know, manifesting a new, a new period of Western history. Okay, so all these things start the modern era, or, you know, we're looking at now modern history, basically stuff that happened over the last 200 years. So this is a good intro, I think, to what we're talking about really for the next 10 weeks, which is modern history. And that takes us all the way up to the present. So I'm going to try and go a little fast through this because I'll upload this to Blackboard and you can take a look at it later if you miss anything. But I want to just lay the groundwork for what we're talking about today and in the next few weeks. One of the big ideas to keep it, like, I could talk about modernity for the rest of the course. Like, I could talk about the idea of it forever. The one thing I want to focus on today is a lot of, with the Enlightenment, with the French Revolution, with the Industrial Revolution, it's bringing in so much rapid change to ideas, to politics, and to the economy of the West. With that rapid change, people start to question, they start to have like very anxious questions about like, what is my place in the world, this rapidly changing world? What kinds of things can we count on being the same? How do we cope with this rapid change? Because a lot of traditional ideas are being swept away, right? The traditional ways of making a living was living on a farm and growing your own livelihood, right? And having lots of kids to work the farm. That's going away because of industrialization. Religion is starting to crumble in places as people start to embrace Enlightenment ideas of, you know, these big ideas of why we're here, what matters. Religion is starting to take a blow. Politics are changing very quickly. Who gets to vote? Who doesn't get to vote? Who has privilege? Who, you know? So change is happening very, very quickly in modern society, almost too fast for people to come to grips with. And the reason why I have, this may not, is this familiar to anyone? Like, has anyone heard of Rocko's Modern Life before or watched the show?
Yes.
Yep.
Maybe, oh, I might have my volume down really low. Sorry, I couldn't hear people. Okay, it's fine if you haven't heard of the show, but I grew up on the show. It's a Nickelodeon show. It's actually pretty hilarious and disgusting. I have no idea why they allowed certain things on Nickelodeon back in the 90s. Rocko's Modern Life is actually kind of a disgusting show.
Have you heard of Mr. Meaty?
No, I haven't. No. Anyway, this show it's anthropomorphic animals. You know, Rocco is like a dingo or somebody. His best friend is a cow. And he lives in this kind of weird, like, world where things are changing very rapidly. And it's like, basically, it's like Seinfeld for kids. And it's just the humdrum of trying to get through daily life and stay sane. Because we're all just kind of struggling with the modern condition. We're all struggling with like, so this is our lives. We work 9 to 5 and then we come home and we zone out to Netflix and we go to sleep and then repeat the same thing the next day. Is that really the best way to live? And there was this kids show that like addressed some of those existential questions. So I had to kind of, give a call out for it. I think Netflix did like a movie last year on it. I haven't watched it. Anyway, Rocco's Modern Life absolutely wrecked me as a child because it brought up existential questions about why we exist. But also a lot of fart jokes and boob jokes. But anyway, so technology, economy, politics are all changing very rapidly in the modern era. And if it sounds like I'm just kind of, rambling off topic from the ideologies I said I was going to talk about, here's the segue into it. Like, here's the off ramp. This is where it connects. With all of this existential dread, people are wondering like, oh my gosh, the world has changed so fast. It's changing every minute. How do I keep up? In place of tradition, in place of religion, in place of, what your granddaddy told you were the true things in life, people start to gravitate towards what are called ideologies as a means of finding answers to these questions. Okay. So that's in like a blanket definition of an ideology is a belief system that offers you answers to the modern world. Okay. Lots of people subscribe to several of these ideologies we're about to talk about, but nonetheless, it's a belief system that gives you some sort of comfort in a rapidly changing environment. That's basically what we're talking about. All right. So I guess I didn't go through that as quickly as I wanted. Sorry for going off topic about Rocco, but we'll try and pick up the pace here. So the first of these ideologies is socialism. One of my favorite things to talk about, mostly because it's such an interesting concept. Also, it's in our politics a lot recently in the United States. And I'm not here to push any particular ideology onto you. I want to make that clear because this week we're talking about socialism, communism, nationalism, anarchism. We're talking about a bunch of different things. I'm simply here to introduce these ideas. I'm not here to force them on you. So I want to make that abundantly clear because right now history professors are being accused of corrupting the youth of America, left, right, and center. And I find myself in a very weird position in this very weird election year. So socialism is one of these ideologies that arises during the Industrial Revolution and into the modern era. Now, it's hard to pin down exactly what socialism is. It's a broad concept. It has lots of different flavors. It has lots of different nuances. If someone tells you, here's what the exact definition of socialism is, they are lying to you or they're trying to sell you something. And that includes me, right? Like, don't just simply trust my little simple definition here. Do your own research about it. Fall down the Wikipedia hole about socialism if you're curious, because what I'm about to tell you does not encompass the entirety of the idea because it's very slippery. It's hard to get a hold of. Anyway, the Dr. Matt Schoner, informal definition of socialism is that it advocates for a stronger public ownership of property and resources and wealth, rather than emphasizing private wealth. Now, you can still have private wealth under socialism. Take a look at more heavily socialist countries than the US, for instance. A lot of European Union countries, France, Germany, Great Britain, have a stronger kind of socialist core to their governments. Look at China. China's not communist by any stretch, even though they say they are. They're a heavily socialist state. There are lots of Chinese millionaires. Like you look anywhere and you'll find that socialism does embrace market economics. But what it emphasizes is a stronger distribution of wealth, because socialism's main idea, like the main idea that kind of spurs this whole thing on, is during the Industrial Revolution, workers were finding themselves working 18-hour days for literally pennies, while the people who owned the factories were raking in millions. And it just didn't make any sense. It's like, you know, this construction of the wealth gap is extremely harmful, according to proponents of socialism. They say that unrestricted capitalism does way more harm to society than it does good. That's what they say. Now you can agree with this or disagree. Like, I'm not here, you know, to sway you in any way, shape, or form. But this is what proponents of socialism see. They see capitalism as inherent. If it's not regulated properly, it does bad things. And socialism seeks to remedy that by adding a few more restrictions to, you know, what the market can do and who benefits from it. So the underlying concept here is that there are way more workers out there than there are elites. And it doesn't make sense for all the wealth to flow up to the, you know, what Bernie Sanders would say, that, you know, the top 1% or 0.1%, you know, of the world. It doesn't make sense because it leaves a lot of people suffering and in need of basic necessities. And they can't afford it because they're being exploited. So therefore, we need a more social-centric system. That's where we get the term socialism. It's like, let's take the big picture of society and let's do what's good for the most amount of people, rather than focus on what's good for a small slice of the population. Like, how could we allow all this suffering to happen around us? That's immoral. It's, in the parlance of the time, it's unchristian to allow people to be exploited by the system. And even if you're not religious, you can see all the suffering that happens in the working class. So it's just a blanket bad thing to allow capitalism to exploit people. So the first kind of pioneer, or one of the first pioneers of socialism, was a French guy named Charles Fourier. He helps kind of build the central tenets of socialism. He's not a name that you're going to hear very often, unlike Karl Marx, who we'll talk about in a second. But nonetheless, he's a really important historical figure. He believes in social cooperation. He's an optimist. He thinks that people are naturally good to one another. And if we just got rid of some systems that make us bad towards one another, we'll be better off. He's a proponent of what maybe we would call today social justice. But they didn't use that term at the time. But he identifies poverty as the main cause of problems in the West. Like, if we could fix poverty, we would do away with the crumbling of the nuclear family. We would do away with crime. We would do away with a lot of unnecessary death and misery from disease or malnutrition because people can't afford food. We would get rid of, you know, homelessness. We would get rid of a lot of social problems if we abolished poverty. Which sounds pretty good, right? I mean, this sounds, you know, like he's on a good track here. I don't know if poverty is like necessarily the main cause of all social issues, but it's there at the root of a lot of them, right? So one of his kind of policy ideas is he proposes a minimum wage for all workers. Maybe what we would call a living wage today. At the time of Fourier, there was no such thing as minimum wage. Workers have to fight for that right. They have to fight for that law to be implemented in the various countries of the West. Trying to think when the minimum wage actually comes about in the United States. I don't think it's until like the early 1900s or something. It's a fairly recent thing. Someone can fact check me on that one though. But this idea of like making a minimum amount of work to sustain yourself. All workers are entitled to that. You know, Bernie over the last several years has had this fight for 15 thing. That's a very Fourier idea. That's a very kind of socialist idea. He also proposes maximum earnings. So like, we're going to abolish billionaires. Jeff Bezos, he's allowed to have millions of dollars, but he can't have billions of dollars. You know, Bill Gates can't have billions. You know, all these other people cannot have billions because that's effectively stealing wealth away from the rest of society. They don't need billions, right? Like that's it. That's wealth beyond sanity, is what Fourier would say. Why would you allow some people to hoard all this wealth while we have people literally starving? That doesn't make any sense. That's immoral. That's unjust. So he proposes like a cap, like people can only make so much money. And then if you make more than that, you have to give it all away to the rest of society. Because again, poverty is the main cause of everything, according to him. So he's this pioneer of early socialist thinking. And you see these ideas. It's interesting because I'm going to go off tangent just a little bit. You see these ideas come up a lot more recently, I think, especially among young people who, you know, millennials and whatever Gen Z, whatever generation you guys are, I don't presume to know. But, you know, there's a lot more interest in these ideas, you know, because some of the economic opportunities that were available to your parents or your grandparents simply aren't around anymore. So we're, you know, a lot of people are calling for more redistribution of opportunity and wealth. So it's interesting to see that enter our political discussion. And of course, people, you know, are ardently opposed to socialism too, and that's fine. But I was looking at my ballot, my mail-in ballot that I got last week for the Illinois elections, and one of the political parties running for president is the Socialist and Liberation Party, and I thought that was really interesting. So these ideas are catching fire once more, a couple hundred years after they're introduced. And by the way, you know, America has a lot of socialist concepts built into it. The 1960s brought in, you know, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security is a huge, that's a socialist idea right there. The idea of Social Security, like the rest of society is going to pay into this pot of money so that old people don't have to work until they die. That's a very Charles Fourier idea. That's a very socialist idea. And we don't think of it that way in the US, but it's right there. It's Social Security. It's right there in the name. It's socialism baked into our system. And we don't think about it. There's also this, along with socialism, there's this utopian strain of thought, and it's a little bit more pie in the sky. It's a little bit more hopelessly romantic. Robert Owen is a utopian socialist. He's also a factory owner of a textile mill in Britain. And he opens this factory in Scotland in 1800 based on socialist ideas. So the idea of the 8-hour workday, like if you work 5 days a week, 8 hours, that's full time. And anything beyond that is overtime. That's a socialist idea. And it's the norm now, but people had to fight. People had to fight for this stuff in the late 1800s, early 1900s, for this stuff to be, you know, enshrined in law in the United States, Britain, Germany, France, elsewhere in the West. This stuff did not just happen overnight. People, that's why we celebrate Labor Day, for God's sakes, you know, because laborers had to fight for these privileges. The 8-hour workday is something that Robert Owen introduces to his employees. He reinvests the profits of his company back into his workers' education. He pays for their kids' the workers' children's schooling. He offers like scholarships for adult workers to go back to school. He implements his own safety standards in his factory. So like a lot of really progressive ideas for being in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, he was alone in a lot of this stuff. Like he was a pioneer in all these things. He believed in paying a living wage. Now, all that is well and good in Scotland, but Robert Owen decides he wants to try and build an experimental utopian community in the United States. And for whatever reason, he moves to Indiana, southern Indiana, right next door, my home state, and he sets up a private community in New Harmony, which is down, I think, in southern Indiana. There's a really good brewery there, but the town is, you know, essentially dead. Long story short, your book talks about Robert Owen more than I'm going to talk about it, but he attempts to set up this like paradise on earth in Indiana, which if you've been to Indiana, it's no paradise. And it completely fails. He tries setting up this community where there's, you know, people can take as much time off as they want. We're going to have, you know, the free schooling. We're going to construct housing for all of our workers so they don't have to pay mortgage. We're blah, 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 blah. There's going to be all these like wonderful things. And it completely collapses, mostly because he goes back to Britain and he isn't there to like run the show anymore. He entrusts it to a few different people and they can't get along and there's lots of squabbling and the community falls apart. But this is one in a number of like utopian socialist communities that try and get off the ground and it just crashes and burns. So take that as you will. But some of his ideas stick around: the 8-hour workday, the living wage, right? A lot of these ideas stick around and they're really good. He just can't make it work on a communal level. All right, I'm gonna go pretty quick through the rest of this. I'm gonna try to anyway. I'm realizing I get kind of excited about these things and I can't stop talking about it. So to follow up on socialism, we get Karl Marx. Karl Marx starts out life as a socialist and then he takes it to the next level. Now I have up here Marxism and communism in one kind of bucket, and they are different things. We'll break that down in a second. Karl Marx is a German-born Westerner. He lives most of his life in England, however, because he wants to be at the center of the action. England allows the most freedom of speech of any European country. It's second only to the United States in allowing freedom of speech. So he's there and he's writing all kinds of crazy ideas because he can't get arrested for doing it in England. He is highly critical of capitalism. Okay, so far so good. He's a good socialist. He sees it exploiting the lower classes. All right, this is par for the course with socialism. But here's where he goes off the rails. Okay, here's where he takes a sharp left turn from normal orthodoxy socialism into something completely new. He prophesies a forthcoming workers' revolution. There's a workers' revolution that's on the horizon. And Marx kind of sees himself as the prophet of this impending event. And he foresees the workers of the world banding together as one class of people, overthrowing their bosses, seizing all the factories and the means of production, and setting up a global workers' utopia. That's communism. And these ideas are elucidated in his book that he co-wrote with Frederick Engels, who you'll remember from a couple weeks ago, reading the document about Manchester and how dirty it is. He and Engels co-wrote the Communist Manifesto and published it in 1848. And in it, he gives his own little, not only does he say that the workers of the world are going to rise up and take control, he gives his own little theory on history. And we call this Marxism. Okay, so communism is this idea of a workers' utopia where everyone shares everything and no one has more than anyone else and they all participate in harmony in building wealth together. That's communism. Marxism is the idea that all of human history can be seen as class struggle. It's all the haves against the have-nots, no matter what period of time you're looking at. It could be the Roman Empire, you know, it could be the oppressed plebes fighting against the Senate and the emperor. It could be the Middle Ages, where you have peasants and serfs tied to the land and the lords own everything and they can do whatever they want to the peasants. You could look at the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, you know, workers making a pittance while everyone else gets rich. He's looking at history through the lens of there's this struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And someday the have-nots are going to overthrow the people who were oppressing them this whole time. That's what Marxism is. So he actually goes beyond traditional socialist ideas because socialism believes in markets. Socialism believes in a regulated form of capitalism. Marx is like, no, capital is bad. Like, we need to abolish capital altogether. We need a full-scale revolution by the working class throughout the world, wherever they are, whether it's Germany, the United States, China, you know, India, who cares? We need all the workers of the world to unite because they outnumber the elites and they could take control if they wanted to. Like, they could do it right now. Which, by the way, Karl Marx predicted that there would be the first communist revolution would happen in the United States. So he was a little off there. You know, the cradle of global capitalism. It hasn't happened so far, and he's been waiting for 150 years. So anyway, all right. Does anyone have any questions so far before I wrap this up? Okay. If you think of anything, just, you know, let me know. Yeah, the next one I want to talk about, we're going to talk about anarchism and nationalism, and then we're going to get out of here. Anarchism, I'll try and go through this briefly. They're another kind of completely out in left field idea. There's this idea that any kind of authority, any form of concentrated authority over people is a bad thing. Like, if socialists believe that poverty is the root of all evil, and communism believes that capitalism is the root of all evil, anarchists believe that authority is the root of all evil. And authority takes lots of different forms. It's, you know, the capital of, you know, people having more wealth than others. It's governments, you know, the city of Springfield and the state of Illinois and the federal government in Washington. That's 3 layers of oppression upon people, where we're forced to pay them taxes and we have to live by their laws and yada yada. Organized religion, the Catholic Church, the Protestant denominations, organized Judaism, like whatever, you know, Islam, it's all evil because it all is a constructed form of authority over you, the individual. They're trying to tell you what to do. That's what anarchism is. Mikhail Bakunin is, I believe, a Russian intellectual who kind of introduces a lot of these ideas. He's a bit out there, and his whole theory is that, you know, back before the modern period, people lived largely free of these constructed institutions. Like, they lived in tribes. They lived in kind of hunter-gatherer, like small communities, and they were happy because they could do whatever they wanted. And if we could go back to that state of nature, people would get along, people would cooperate. So again, returning to the state of nature or small tribes of people, that's That's the most organized form of authority that we should allow ourselves, because anything beyond that is oppression. Yeah, I don't put much stock in anarchism, but you know, this is Bakunin. And he was living during a time of nationalism, which we'll talk about in just a second. But the idea of the nation, the idea of countries coming together and, you know, concentrating people under one form of authority is just a really bad idea. He thinks it's just a really bad idea because it's oppression and it takes people's freedom. Who needs a social contract? Like, screw the contract. We're going to rip it up. I'm going to go live on my own in the wilderness and make my own rules. That's anarchism. All right. One last thing. Nationalism. Nationalism is probably the most important ideology to come out of this period because it sticks more than socialism, more than communism, definitely more than anarchism. Nationalism sticks, like it takes off in the 1800s. And nationalism today means something a little bit different. Like if you turn on Fox News, which I had a couple of years ago, and they were talking about, they had some talking heads extolling the virtues of nationalism. What they meant was, their definition of nationalism was, the United States is the most exceptional country in the world. It's God's chosen country. And therefore, the United States can do whatever it wants. The rules do not apply to the United States. We're exceptional. Nationalism in the historical context means people congregating together that share a common history, a common culture, and a common language. So you need those three things. Like you need this idea of like people identify with one another based on their sameness. If you all speak the same language and you all follow the same brand of, in Europe it would be Christianity, and you all have this kind of common past or this idea of a history, then you constitute a nation. And therefore, that national identity supersedes any other identity you might have, right? If you're Croatian, that means you're more than just being, a local member of your Zagreb community. It means you're more than just a Catholic. It means you're more than, whether you're a man or a woman. Like your national identity is the most supreme identity that you should have. You should identify it as an American, before you identify as an Illinoisan or a Democrat or a feminist. Like all these other ideas that you might have are less important than you being for your nation and getting a country that recognizes your shared identity. So basically you're looking, what we have is in the 1800s when this idea comes about, Napoleon was conquering everything, and nationalism was a response to this idea. It was like, those of us living in Germany, we're not French. Why should we have the French conquering us? Let's build a German nation to counter the French. Or Poland. We're all Polish, we're all Catholic, we all have the same Polish history, we speak Polish. We deserve a Polish nation to build a country around so we can do what we want and not be conquered by the Russians or whatever. So it's a good idea in theory, but in its extreme form, it becomes a really dangerous thing because it slides into that. Not only do we deserve our own national identity, not only do we deserve our own country, but our country is better than your country, and we deserve things that you have that you don't deserve, whether that's land or resources or even independence. I'm old enough to remember the invasion of Iraq, and there was this huge kind of nationalist impulse that seized the United States in the early 2000s after 9/11. And basically the rest of the world was saying, like, the United States can't just like walk into Iraq and take whatever they want. But those of us in the US were like, yeah, we can. We've got the biggest military. Saddam Hussein's a terrible person. Weapons of mass destruction are being cooked up, you know, for terrorist attacks, which ended up not being true. And, you know, it was this idea that we could take whatever we wanted because we're America. That's where it becomes a little extreme, and that's where it becomes dangerous. And hundreds of thousands of people have died in Iraq as a result of that. So I wanted to be clear that nationalism is not the same as garden variety patriotism. Patriotism is having pride in one's country. You know, British people are patriotic British people. You know, they take pride in being British. Americans can take pride in being American. You know, you're allowed to do that. What you're not allowed to do, if you're a moral person, is say, my country's better than your country, therefore I'm going to kick your ass. And I'm going to take whatever you have because we deserve it and you don't. You're an inferior species of humanity. That's not okay, right? Like, I'll place a value judgment on that. That's not okay. That's nationalism in its most extreme form, which is different than patriotism, right? Patriotism is the mild pride that you have that doesn't call for all-out warfare or enslavement of other people, right? So there you have it. That's what I've got for you guys today. That was a long one, I know. Sticking with it, those 10 of you who are here. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, cool. You having sat through this will prepare you immensely for the next exam, and also for the next analysis paper assignment, which will happen in 2 weeks. So good on you for being here and sticking with it. All right, well, that's all I have for you guys. If you don't have any questions, that's fine by me. I'll see you on Friday for when we discuss. We're going to talk about Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, he's a French guy who visits the United States, and he writes about freedom that he sees in the United States. So we're going to bring the US into this conversation more and more and more. So yeah, we're going to talk about that, and let me know if you have any questions. Or no, sorry, that's next week. This week we're talking about the Communist Manifesto and Sarah Ellis talking about how feminism is bad. It'll be an interesting Friday discussion. All right, guys, take care. Have a good one. Let me know if you have any questions.